Hello, Keith Rucker here at VintageMachinery.org. Guys, back working on the Diresta Bandsaw, and in our last episode on this, we worked on pouring the Babbitt bearings on the bottom shell down here for the bottom wheel. And as promised, up next, we need to pour the top half of these shells. Now, I talked a little bit about Babbitt bearings in the last episode. I'm not going to really recover that here. If you didn't see the first part of this, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at that video because we do go into a little bit more detail on Babbitt bearings and how their process is done, so on and so on. Pouring the top half of the shells is a little bit different in this case. We got to do a little bit of prep work to get things ready for it, and that's what we're about to start working on. So let's get over here, show you what we got, and come up with a game plan to get this thing knocked out. Let's pour some bearings. So this is basically the top caps that go on to that bearing shell down there. And it's a pretty large casting. You got basically two pads in here. Just like in the bottom, you kind of got a front bearing and a back bearing, and there's kind of an open area in the middle. So we're really pouring two separate bearing shells here at the same time, but an open, like I said, open area in the middle. You know, normally you would just have a cap that just bolted down on that. In this case, we got all this stuff going on the bottom, and this is in one piece. Usually what you would see is actually two separate caps rather than one casting here. The reason for this, and you got the little hole here, is this was actually for a belt shifter on that lathe when it was originally set up to run off of an overhead line shaft. Of course, we're not going to be utilizing an overhead line shaft with this saw. So really, this whole bracket here doesn't serve any purpose as it is now, but we want to leave it on there because it is original to the machine. It's part of its history, and it's kind of cool. So that's kind of where we're at here. But because of the way that this whole casting is done, it's going to present a few challenges for us as we move forward. This would be a lot easier if we just had two bearing shells that bolted down on the top, and we could very easily pour these. But the big thing we got going on is this gap in the middle where there's not going to be any Babbitt. So we're going to have to put some damming material in there basically to keep the Babbitt from just rolling in through there and filling up this huge cavity with Babbitt, which is not what we want to do. So let's kind of zoom in here and show you what I'm talking about. And I've got an idea on how I'm going to do this. Also need to get this cleaned up before we get too deep into it as well. Just get my wire wheel in here and make sure we got that good and clean. So let me show you this real quick. So here's the big challenge we got. And again, that's this kind of open area in here. You can see that when this casting was originally done, they had a core that went down in here. And the core, basically, this was just a sand core that was in there so that it would not be solid cast iron. This was hollow on the inside. There was no reason for this to be solid cast iron. It's actually stronger like this. It's more like a structural tube rather than a solid member. It's in many ways, this is structurally more sound. But anyway, the biggest reason they did it, of course, is to save on weight, save on materials, save on money. But we've got this hollow area in here. And again, we don't want the Babbitt. Of course, this will be flipped over when we're doing it, but still we don't want the Babbitt filling in this area. So my game plan is, I think what I'm going to do is, I don't really want to cram this whole thing full of damming material. I mean, I could, but that's just kind of not needed. So I think what I'm going to do is just kind of stuff some paper down in here to kind of take up some space, and then actually cut a little piece of wood to kind of fit down in here. And then we can put the damming material on top of that, and that way we won't have to put as much in here. That's kind of my game plan. The wood and the paper, of course, yes, they will burn, but you know, we're not get this thing up hot enough, I think, for that to be an issue. We'll be heating it up with a torch, a couple hundred degrees, but up in this area, I don't think it's going to be an issue. So anyway, that's my game plan. That's what we're going to do. And before I do anything else, I do want to get my angle grinder out with the wire wheel and just clean this up real good. I'll do that off camera. All right, so got the wire wheel in here, cleaned this stuff up. That looks good. And I just took a little piece of plywood and just kind of cut it out over on the bandsaw and using the sander and got it to where it fit down in here. And it's actually in there good and tight. I mean, I took a hammer and kind of hammered it in there, and it's not going anywhere. So I ended up not having to put any filler up underneath it like I was thinking I was going to have to do to kind of give it some support it's going to be fine just like it is. So no paper wadded up underneath there, which makes me feel a little bit better, because I was a little bit concerned that, with the heating this up with the torch, I'm not worried about this wood catching on fire, but that paper, yeah, possibly. I just feel better without it. So anyway, I think we are getting a little bit closer here. Next thing I need is we need to have some shims in between the bottom and this top. And we need to put those shims in when we pour the bearings, because that's going to basically become ground zero. And the idea with the shims is that as the Babbitt wears over time, you can actually take some of the shims out and tighten the bearing back up. So these things kind of wear in over a period of time. So you want to have a fairly good gap, probably about 1/8 of an inch gap in there that you can take up as the machine wears in. So I usually use like some gasket paper for that. On old machines, I've seen all kinds of stuff used. I mean, I've seen just even like cardboard, not like a box, or like a shipping box. It has the corrugation in it, but thin cardboard, like would be on that doesn't have the corrugation on the inside, the solid cardboard, this maybe 32nd or 16th of an inch thick. I've seen that used on a lot of old bearings. I've seen metal shims in there. Honestly, the metal shims work great, but they're kind of a pain to have to cut out and everything. I prefer using a softer material. Let me see what I can find out here in the shop to use as for some shims. I usually try to keep some gasket paper in the shop just for this purpose, and we'll cut some out to fit both of these, and we'll be ready to get over there and start getting this thing a little bit farther along for pouring. I dug around and found some gasket. This is some fairly thick gasket material. You see it's kind of stiff, about 60 thousandths of an inch thick. This is actually some, I think, high heat stuff. It's got non-asbestos on here, written on it. What I did was, because this was kind of a sheet, I just took it over to my table saw and cut some strips out of it, cut them to length, and I think these are going to work out just fine. I'm going to do 2 pieces of this on each side. That will put about 120 thousandths of a gap in between this, and that's basically how much material can be taken out to tighten this bearing up over time, which should be plenty, quite honestly. So I do need to get some holes in these for the bolts to go through. Probably will also kind of round these corners off on the end so they're not sticking out. Try to make them match this. I'll just probably, I don't know, we'll figure something out. I may cut it out with a razor, or we'll see. Actually I could probably just cut them off a little short, but yeah, I'll cut that little radius in there. It'll take an extra step. Let's see, I think I got some punches that I can use to cut these holes. If not, we can probably drill them, but let me see if I can punch them first. I'm gonna go see if I can dig that up if I've got the right size for that size hole. So to cut these holes, I've got this little punch kit that I picked up somewhere along the way. It says MSC Industrial. This is for actually cutting holes in shims, probably metal shims, but I'm going to try it in this. This stuff will fit up through here. There's, you can see through this, and I kind of got cross hatches on there, and I can kind of line that up with the cross hatch that's on the bottom of this plastic. There's a little punch that fits down through here, and let's see how this works. Looks like it did a charm. Yeah. So, all right, that did work. So I think what's happening is this material just kind of is collapsing around it a little bit and making that punch not want to come out real easily, but we can work with it. I'm gonna line up the second one here. This is a 3/4 inch hole I'm putting in here, which is slightly larger than the bolt hole needs to be, but I'd rather have that little bit extra room. There we go. And drive that back out the other way. And third one here. All right, I'll go knock that out the other direction there. These shims are all ready to go. We got the holes punched. I went ahead and trimmed these ends up. I just did it over on my bandsaw, actually. Worked just fine. A little rough, but it's not going to matter. It's going to be crammed in there and clamped in there. It won't matter one bit. So I think we are ready. I need to get some molding material there, or damming material in there, and on the inside, and clamp this thing together over there. And I think we'll be really close to pouring bearings. We're getting really, really close here. So anyway, making progress. We'll bring you back in a minute. Next thing I want to do is put some of this heat resistant damming material in here, kind of to create that gap in between here, between the bearings and this area in the middle where we don't want anything to go. And I'm just trying to make sure that I got it sealed off really well in there, down in the bottom and around that transition zone. And what will happen is that shaft will kind of conform to this. I'll just kind of work it in here. This is showed this in the last video. This is the kind of a putty type material. It's heat resistant that we use for damming in Babbitt bearings, creating a dam where you don't want the Babbitt to flow. Next thing I want to do is I'm going to start working on scraping these bearings down here on the bottom side a little bit. What happens is when this metal cools after it pours, it kind of shrinks, and as it does, it just makes that bearing a little bit of a tight fit. Now we put the black surface on there. That did kind of build up a little bit of extra metal, but even so, these bearings are too tight right now. So I'm using a bearing scraper, which is a tool like this right here, and you just come in here and you just go back and forth, and you can see it kind of pulls up just a little thin layer of Babbitt. And we're going to work all around that surface, and we're going to basically make this bearing diameter just a little bit larger, and I'll keep coming over here and test fitting with the shaft until it will just rotate real easily. Right now it's sitting all the way down into the bottom of these shells, these bearings, but it just doesn't turn real easily. So I'm going to go ahead and scrape the bottom ones. I have to do the same thing on the top, but let's just make sure that we got the bearing going down into the very bottom and fitting good before we pour the top half. I'm going to work on this for a while. Like I said, it's just kind of a process, similar to scraping ways, but different at the same time. You can blue your shaft up and look for high spots and go forth. Usually I just kind of go until I get a good fit, and until it will just spin real easily, and we go from there. So, all right, I'll be back. We're going to do some scraping here. Well, after a little bit of work here, this is turning pretty easily. Still a little bit tight, but when we get a little oil in there, and I'll probably do a little more scraping toward the end here, but I think that's going to be fine for now. So I'm going to pull the shaft back out. We need to put some damming material back down here in this bottom to keep the Babbitt from, when we pour it in the top, going down there, finding that hole and filling it in. And I think after that, we'll be ready to assemble this thing and get it ready for a pour. All right, pull this out. All right, we got our bottom shaft positioned in there. We got our filler in the middle there where it's not going to fill up this middle section with any Babbitt. So that's all filled in. Next thing I want to do is blacken that shaft again with some carbon. Again, that just kind of helps release, as well as give me a little bit of extra room in there. Now, instead of doing the shaft outside, I'm just going to come over here and just blacken it on it like this right here, and this will serve just fine. All right. And kind of wipe that off a little bit on the sides. Probably doesn't really matter. I'm trying to avoid touching my shaft though. Okay. Put our shims in here. I'm going to put a little layer of this stuff on the ends here just to make sure we got enough damming material on the ends to help keep that. We've got some spacer in there, kind of like we did up in the shaft, but this is just a little bit extra on the ends where the Babbitt's going to be pouring from. Just gives me a little bit more insurance in there. It should flatten out when we tighten the bolts up. All right. Put our bolts in here. Now, one thing I will comment, I did it off camera, but on all these bolts, I went and took them to a wire wheel. I cleaned them up really good. I also did a little grinding around the corners because over the years they've been tightened up. We had some sharp edges and places where the wrench wouldn't fit on right. So I kind of just knocked all that off with a grinder. And then I ran all these bolts up onto a die and just made sure that the threads were good. A couple of them kind of had some rolled threads. Most of them just screwed right up on it, wasn't even tight. But a couple of them, there were some burrs on the threads. And the other thing I did was down in the casting below, let's get that one lined up. I ran a tap all the way down into that casting below and just cleaned up those threads as well. So we should have good threads on all these pieces here. All right, we'll get these on, tighten them up, and we're getting close to being ready to pour. All right, I got them all finger tight. So now we'll just take a wrench here and we'll just tighten everything down. And I'm not trying to super torque this thing, but I do want to get it fairly snug. That's good. And we'll do it about like that on all of them. This side is pretty much ready, but we need to cap off this end, put a dam on there. And I just got, this is actually the piece that goes on this machine. It's a little bit larger diameter than the ones that I made. I'm going to put that on there, and what we're going to do, that will dam this up, keep any metal from rolling out around it. But I'm going to use some of the Deacon mold pack again, and we're just going to reinforce all the way around this thing with some of this damming material, just make sure it doesn't come out in any small cracks or anything. So, and that'll also help position it on there, hold it in place, where if I were to bump it or something, it wouldn't open up. All right, that looks good. Now, one other thing is we're going to be pouring through the hole up here in the top. This is the oil hole where you oil it from. This is going to be where we also pour from. We'll have to drill these back out once we get it poured. But notice my casting is broken over here on the side. And just to give me a little basin, pouring basin in there, I'm going to also add a little bit on the side here. And that'll just make sure that it doesn't roll down the side as much when I'm pouring this bearing. I'm basically just kind of artificially making a lip over here like we have on this side. Here we go. Just take a quick peek over here on the other side. You can see I got it dammed up as well. Note that up underneath all of this, I got my other bushing like this. This is the one we turned. It was on the bottom half, it was on there like this, sitting on that shelf, but I just turned it around where I have the flat side up against, and it's all up underneath there. So that's up under there. Also note that we got a little hole right here that we'll be pouring into, and I built up again a little pouring basin around that just to give me a little bit larger area to hit, a little bit more head on it where the Babbitt can hopefully flow down in there. This is all ready to pour, I believe. So next we're gonna go get our Babbitt melting, and we'll get our torch going and put a preheat on this casting up here so that it'll be ready to pour. Let's go do that. So I had a little bit of Babbitt left over from the last pour, plus I kind of swept up my shavings and put them in there just because I'm cheap and I don't like to throw that stuff away. So we're going to start by getting our torch going here. I'm going to turn my stove on, but usually when I'm starting from scratch, hey, we're going to cheat. Get some heat in there and then let the stove do its work. Just saves a little bit of time. We'll get that in the bottom going, and I got some more Babbitt I'm going to put in there. I talked a little bit about Babbitt in my last part of this series, but real briefly, we're using a tin-based Babbitt here, and I'm reusing what was in the saw originally. Babbitt comes more or less in two flavors. There's actually lots of different alloys out there, but when you get down to it, there's a tin-based Babbitt and there's a lead-based Babbitt. And as the names imply, it just kind of depends on what the base material is in them. Original Babbitt was tin-based. Later on, they came out with more lead-based Babbitts. They were commonly called anti-friction metals rather than just true Babbitts. But a lot of people just still call it, this all called Babbitt. I am using what's in there. I can tell that this is a tin-based Babbitt looking at it. I've done enough Babbitt work over the years that I've learned how to kind of tell the difference between the two. And the tin-based Babbitt just is a little bit more shiny and not quite as dull looking as the lead-based Babbitt. And this is tin Babbitt in there, and we are reusing it. All right, that's more or less liquid. We're just going to let that heat up. And while that's doing that, I'm going to go over to the casting and start putting a preheat on that as well. Now what I'm doing is, again, we're preheating our casting over here. I talked again about this kind of in my last video on Babbitt, but this tin-based Babbitt's going to melt around 750, 800 degrees, somewhere along in there. And the whole idea here is we put a little preheat down in here. I want to get it down on that shaft too. It just, it doesn't cool as fast when you pour it in. If we pour it cold, as soon as that hot Babbitt hits that cold metal, it's going to want to cool real quick, and it's going to want to shrink real quick, and you end up getting it's not as pretty as a pour. So I try to heat up the castings, probably around 300 degrees, roughly. It really doesn't matter. You're not trying to get this super, super hot. Just hot enough to kind of help things out. And yes, my demi material is burning a little bit, but nothing too bad. We'll put a little bit more heat in this, and we'll be ready to pour. All right, we are ready to pour. I'm going to come in this front hole right here. I'll probably get a little splattering coming out of there. There we go. We'll let that cool. I've got this side all preheated now, and we're going to come in here and do the same thing as before, right down the hole. A little bit messy, but we're getting it done. And we have a little splatter, but no big deal. I like to wear cotton clothes when I'm doing this, and the first one you guys probably noticed, dummy me, I forgot to pull my sleeves down. I had them rolled up. Fortunately, nothing burned me. But you're going to get some splatter, particularly on these on the top bearings like this. You just get some gases trapped inside of there. When you're doing the bottom ones, you usually got enough off-gassing where it doesn't matter. This Babbitt that comes off, it will usually just come right off. I'm going to melt it back down. I'll get this stuff up off the floor, and we're just going to let this cool down. Well, guys, I think we're going to stop right there on this episode. I've pretty much run out of time, and what we're going to do is we're going to let that shaft cool down overnight. And in fact, it's probably going to be several days because I'm going out of town. But we'll come back and pull this thing apart. And still got a good bit of work to do on this shaft before it's going to be done. After we get it separated out, getting everything scraping, getting the oil holes drilled out, et cetera, et cetera. One comment I want to make about the splattering, I noticed that probably was a little bit shocking to some folks, but that's actually pretty common, particularly when you're pouring into those top bearing halves, and just explaining what's going on. And now when we did the bottom halves, we didn't get all that splattering, and the reason is because it was open on both sides, had plenty of area for all the gases to come out of there. When you're doing the top half of that bearing, you basically have everything is contained inside of it that you're pouring into. You got a shell that you're filling up, and you've just got a little small hole that everything is going in. And whenever you pour that Babbitt in there, two things are happening. Number one, it's getting really hot in there really fast, and that's causing the air inside that hole to expand and want to escape. The second thing that's happening is that you're actually filling the hole up. So in addition to all that air wanting to come out, you're actually displacing the air with the metal coming in there. And what happens is because you're pouring into the same hole that the air is exiting out of, sometimes you just get that splattering. It's part of it. You wear some protective clothing, everything's cool. Well, it can get hot, but if you're wearing good protective clothing, you should be fine. Typically, when I'm pouring bearings, I want to wear cotton clothes, like I mentioned in the video earlier. I want to wear gloves. I want to wear a face shield. I usually got a hat on. I just am trying to protect myself. And yeah, I was a little bit careless. That first one didn't have my sleeves rolled down, and fortunately, I didn't get anything splattered up on me and burn me. But you look at my aprons and stuff that I wear, a lot of times you'll see Babbitt all over them because the Babbitt just splatters when you pour them. Enough on that. That is going to be a wrap. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Those thumbs up and comments, always appreciated. To all my Patreons out there that support the channel financially, thank you, thank you, thank you. We couldn't do this without you. And with that, guys, we are going to sign off, and we will catch you on the next video.